Welcome, everybody. It's time for our monthly series of Talk with a Historian. This month is March, and this month we're focusing on women's history and women's suffrage and all the things that come along with that. Last year was an important opportunity that we missed, and I have a feeling that we'll hear more about that. So let me introduce our panel. We have Andrea Malcolm, who is the director, he's the executive director for the Molly Brown House and Museum. We have Jerry Cummins, who is, you probably have read her writing. She's with the League of Women Voters and writes the pamphlets that you get around elections and has been doing that for a number of years. And those pamphlets, I think, are invaluable to everybody, letting us know what the issues are. And boy, howdy, are we excited. We have Mrs. Margaret Brown. She has returned to us and will be joining us tonight with her perspective and some ideas in terms of women's history and women's suffrage. So with that, Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you for having us this evening, Celeste. Well, we're going to start out this evening by welcoming our Mrs. Margaret Molly Brown to the virtual microphone to just give us a little bit of background on her life and story and her suffrage activism that took place during her life. So I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Brown.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here to tell such a wonderful story, not only the story that I lived in my life, and as we will continue on in discussing, is the continual history that we're making today for women. Where I began really is, it's helpful to understand my background, and that was, I was born into a very poor family in Hannibal, Missouri. And both my parents were, you know, when I really look back at it, they were true activists. My father was involved with the Underground Railroad system, it is said, and my mother was very active with assisting with a settlement of the Irish. Of course, I'm Irish, and but we were very, very poor, and we lived in a 16 by 30-foot home, not too far up from the Mississippi River. And early on in my childhood, I experienced and watched a lot of situations in Hannibal where people were suffering, people that, like ourselves, who did not have money, really were struggling along to get ahead. And with that, after I was able to attend, my mother insisted that I have an 8th grade education. And after that, I went to work in a tobacco factory. And with that, my brother, Daniel, had heard of this place to move to, and it was called Leadville, Colorado. And in turn, he wrote me a letter and said, Margaret, you must come and visit me. There's so much going on here, and I think you'd really like it. So in 1886, I picked myself up and took a train with my stepsister to Leadville, Colorado. And there I started really observing all different lifestyles, number one. Number two, all different situations that people were going through. And seeing that really men in the mining world were the predominant, let's say, driver for that occupation. And women were very much to be seen and not heard, and to play the role of taking care of the family. A lot of women were working in, you know, the laundry shops, and I proceeded to get a job at a place called Daniels and Fisher, repairing carpets and draperies. And that was in April I arrived. In June of 1886, I attended a church picnic, and being of the strong Catholic girl I was, went to this church picnic. And in this picnic activities was a gentleman by the name of J.J. Brown. And my intentions of coming to Leadville was to find a rich man. And not only for the purposes of we all smile when we say that, but two, someone that could take care of me and take care of my family. We fell in love. He was not rich by any stretch of the means. He was worked in the mining world. In September, excuse me, in September we were married and ended up having two beautiful children. We moved to Denver, and this is where I really started getting engaged with all the activities. I was a charter member of the Denver Women's Club and spent some time working with a lot of different women on women's issues. And one of the things that really came to me as a reality is, why did women not have equal rights? And not only so much voting, but when you think about it, we couldn't attend college, we couldn't own a home. And there were so many things that were being contributed to that issue that I wanted to get engaged with it. I not only was engaged with the issue around women's rights, children's rights, minors' rights, and I ended up in 1914, decided to run for the Senate. And there was a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of, the fact that Colorado was the first state that allowed women to vote. Women were a little bit more outspoken, I think, because, excuse me, because of that. And pardon me, because of my concern about minors, there was another activity taking place at the same time I was running to bid for Senate, that there was a terrible incident that happened in Trinidad, Colorado, and it is called the Ludlow Massacre. And it was an unfortunate situation where the militia came in because they were protesting equal rights for minors, and because when I look back, we're given out of the hard work for minors, and I was just so passionate the fact that this was happening. There were people down in that area that were killed. Well, the fact that my husband, we were legally separated at the time, because my husband was involved in the management of mining, I was really torn. And I thought the best thing for me to do is go down and visit this activity and see what was going on. And I soon decided that I was going to start my efforts around minors. And so because of that, I dropped my bid for the Senate. But I continued on in many facets of my life for women's rights. I had an opportunity to move to Newport just temporarily. I became friends with Alva Belmont Vanderbilt, who became a friend of mine, who was, of course, Newport was the headquarters for the women's effort. And I was, rubbing elbows in a sense with so many wonderful women that were very passionate about women's rights. So I ended up actually temporarily living there, and was very involved with the National International Women's Conference, where everyone got together, women got together to discuss what can we do, what are the issues, how can we move forward. And so I was, like so many other women, involved in some way, shape, or form, working on votes for women. And believe it or not, when the 19th Amendment was passed, I was elated, absolutely elated that transpired. And of course, as Celeste mentioned, that was 100 years ago, as of last year. And I, can go on and on and on, and I've spent, really, I think, by a lot of time that I really should take to talk about me in that period of time, engaging as a woman a strong woman when we weren't supposed to do any of that. And there was a lot of us out there. And of course, there's still a lot of us still out there. But I feel very proud that I was able to be involved with all of that, and look forward to discussing anything further and any kind of questions that you might have of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown, for that modest glimpse into your story. Your story is much broader than that and much more amazing. But so how do we, as historians at the Molly Brown House Museum, use the story of Mrs. Brown as sort of the next question? And how do we know what we know? And how do we go to the primary sources to learn what we know about Mrs. Brown and your involvement in all of these different activities? Over the course of the last couple decades, we've really had new sources come to light that have really given us a almost day-to-day glimpse of your work in the suffrage movement, your bid for the US Senate in 1914. So that's what we like to share when we sort of make that connection then. So Mrs. Brown was, of course, active in the suffrage movement here in Colorado, even though when they moved to our house on Pennsylvania, they had, the women had the right to vote, the first state to pass it as a popular vote referendum, just after Wyoming and Utah did as territories. So Mrs. Brown, you were a full voting citizen at that point in Colorado. But then, like many women, turned it into a national voting effort, and Colorado led the way as a model. So that by the 19-teens, when Mrs. Brown is living in Newport, Rhode Island, some of our greatest sources from this time really shed light on Mrs. Brown's life through the scrapbook of a niece named Helen. So niece Helen collected this scrapbook that is filled with newspaper articles and from letters and photographs that really tell us about this time. And then we were able to, in advance of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, get into other archives and papers, such as those of Doris Stevens, those of Alice Paul, to really create a picture of those months in 1914, when the Conference of Great Women happened in July, when Margaret worked with Alva Belmont to open up Marble House and host hundreds and hundreds of women and people from across the US, including our own Judge Benjamin Barr Lindsay, who Margaret had already worked with for well over a decade to work on juvenile court reform. And then our own state senator, Helen Ring Robinson, the first woman elected to that post here, and who Margaret was supposedly running against in 1914 when they sort of mutually colluded and decided that no, Helen's gonna stay in her seat and maybe Mrs. Brown should aim a little bit higher. Well, Mrs. Brown aiming a little bit higher, AKA US Senate seat, was to run then against US Senator Charles Thomas, who was in office. And this rolls into what was happening in Newport in August and September of 1914 then, when you have women like Alice Paul, who's now part of the Congressional Union, an offshoot of NASA, that is looking at a strategy to forget the state-by-state referendum altogether and let's go for a national vote. And we're going to do this by punishing the party in power, the Democratic Party, who will not grant women the right to vote. So Margaret is a part of those meetings. We have documentation that puts her there as a host for several meetings to a new publication called The Suffragist, and making those connections and corresponding with these women who are doing this work and laying out this strategy. So Mrs. Brown's bid, your bid, Mrs. Brown, for Senator Thomas's seat plays into this punish the party in power tactic to take down all the Democrats for not granting women the right to vote. However, by September, it's decided Mrs. Brown is working tirelessly on the Ludlow effort to draw attention to that and try to get those responsible to be held accountable in some way. Also, we have something unfolding across the waters in Europe with World War I. And then we also have, knowing that Senator Thomas is also pro-suffrage and he's on many of the suffrage committees. So Alice Meredith, whom we know here in Colorado for running the Denver Elections Commission and then moving to DC and being very politically involved in voting rights. And then Margaret's friend, Senator Helen Robinson, sort of looking at the landscape here in Colorado and deciding it's not a good time for Mrs. Brown to run up against Senator Thomas. So our dear Mrs. Brown puts her bid to the side, says she'll pick it up maybe in the next cycle. But of course, World War I then takes up much of her time. But the efforts of women like Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt are finally successful with the passage of the 19th Amendment, where women are granted the right to vote in 1920, 100 years ago. So at the Molly Brown House Museum, we use that story and Mrs. Brown's involvement as a way to then start pulling threads out. To use those primary sources and use Margaret's biography as a way to then talk about, the largest enfranchisement in American history of voters, and, as a women's rights issue, and talk about how did we get there, but then also recognize who wasn't necessarily included in the 1920 enfranchisement of voters. It would take until the 1965 Voting Rights Act to enfranchise women of color, women in the South, who were left out thanks to Jim Crow laws, voter ID laws, literacy tests, all the tactics used to keep women and people of color out of the voting boxes. So we love to tease that story out and understand that enfranchisement through the story of Mrs. Brown. And we also often partner with the League of Women Voters. Before shutdown, we were able to run voter registrations and help tell this story, because the story, as Jerry will tell us, really starts with that passage of the 19th Amendment and the birth of the League of Women Voters. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerry. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrea. As you mentioned, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, and that was the culmination of many, many, many years of work that Susan B. Anthony started way back in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And she was not alive to see that vote take place and the passage of the women's right to vote occur and give all those new voters an opportunity to participate in our civic life. You mentioned Carrie Catt and Alice Paul, and Carrie Catt was the founder of the League of Women Voters back then, and her thinking at the time was that voters, we need to educate them. They need to know what they're voting on. They need to have the opportunity to learn about the issues, and that was the basis of the League of Women Voters. Not only to educate the voters, but also to work on the issues that were of pressing importance of the day, such as child labor laws, factory labor protections, all those kinds of issues. That hasn't changed for the League over the years. We still work on the education of voters. We still work on the advocacy on issues. And I have to point out that thanks to our founders, we're still a nonpartisan organization. We don't support or oppose candidates. We have a lengthy history of having to study on the issues and arrive at positions through what is termed consensus. And from that, we can take advocacy positions on a number of issues. And over the years, those have included things such as in the environmental area, the air quality, clean water, more recently, protections around gas and oil. We have worked on election law. You mentioned some of the things that were intended to inhibit women from seeking the right to vote. Well, guess what? We're at the same point today in many states. We're so fortunate here in Colorado to have the kind of election system that we do. And we're taking numerous inquiries from states across the country, not only through the League, but through the Secretary of State's office about how our mail-in ballot system works and how do we register voters. And we're so very open, and that is so fortunate. You mentioned that I had worked on the ballot issues pamphlet, and thank you for that acknowledgement, Celeste. It's been rather fascinating. I did have the opportunity to go back through our files a few years ago, and I found a ballot issues pamphlet from 1944.
Hmm.
One of the issues on the ballot that year was, should we grant women the right to serve on juries?
Oh,
And I have been doing a little bit more digging on that particular issue, but it had been debated in the legislature for many years about whether women should serve on juries. And of course, the arguments were they were too emotional. They should be protected from heinous crimes and so on and so forth, and all the usual arguments. And in 1944, the legislature finally sent it to ballot as a referendum. And I guess it passed because I've been called for jury duty a number of times, and I'll bet all of the rest of you have too. So I thought that was rather fascinating. You mentioned the early women who ran for office, and thank you, Molly Brown, for doing that. You ran for the US Senate, and we still have not had a US senator who was female from Colorado. We're overdue.
maybe I can run again.
Not the US, we've had members of the House of Representatives serve. You mentioned Pat Schroeder, obviously that's the one, and currently Diana DeGette from Denver as a female legislator or congressperson. But still we have not had a woman serve in the office of governor or as a US senator. So our time's coming one of these days. I'm sure it will happen. We have had people, as you mentioned, Molly, running for the Senate. We've had people, females running for governor, either in primary or on the November ballot. And one of these days that will occur. But we can also look to our state legislature. And our legislature is one of the top legislatures in the country with the largest percentage of women in office. And it typically runs in the 40 to 50%. I don't think we've ever quite hit 50%, but it's certainly been around 47%. So, you know, it's certainly recognized, and I have heard over the years that when a certain demographic reaches 20% of the body in which they are operating, they cease to become thought of as a minority and they become a regular part. So we have certainly surpassed that. So congratulations to all of those women of all political stripes who have reached out and run for office in their communities at the lower level and also for state office. We were founded in 1920, and I'm going to jump to the Colorado League for a moment here. We were started in 1928 by a lady named Mabel Costigan. Her husband was a senator, and she had a lot of influential friends. And to have people run for office, much like today. So that's what was started. However, we were not known as the League of Women Voters at that time because there was another organization that had copyrighted that name with the Secretary of State's office. So we were initially known as the Women's Citizens League. And we tried to negotiate our way. I've read, I wasn't around then, negotiate with the other group to take the name, although they were not active. But that took about another 12 years. And in 1940, the other organization was defunct. And we adopted the name League of Women Voters to coincide with the national organization. So we've been League of Women Voters since 1928, 1940, depending on which year you want to take. So that covers a lot of our organization's history. We've worked on all of those issues. I think what we've seen in the state legislature with the number of women that have increased in percentage in the legislature, are the addressing of issues that you might consider women's issues. I consider them family issues because everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants good education for their kids. Everybody wants clean air to breathe, all those kinds of things. The league was active in working on the children's code that is in statute in today's laws. So we've got a long history. More recently, we've worked on campaign finance, all kinds of things political. We've been involved in educating the public as the mail ballots came on board and how voters should work with those and get those back in. It was a change, and it was very popular change amongst the citizens in our state. So I'll take any questions, try to answer them.
I have a question, Jerry. You've been talking about how some of the issues that the League of Women Voters is working on now and has historically, sort of get pigeonholed as women's issues, but in fact, they're environmental issues, things like that. Historically, do you have more examples of what some of those issues were for the League that were important?
Back in the 70s, I was reading a little history the other day. The women in the league got very interested in money and how is it being spent, and is it being spent wisely? And so they did a study on fiscal issues and adopted a position that we still use today, that government services should be adequately funded by the state. I think you can always argue what are those state services and at what level do they become adequate or not adequate. And that will always be subject to differing opinions. We've noticed too over the years that, as you mentioned, pigeonhole, Andrea, I always get a question every election cycle from some news reporter nationally or locally or whatever. What are the women's issues? And my answer is always, they're all women's issues. They're all men's issues. And we need to think of those in that term, because what affects one affects all of us. It really does.
And that was certainly the case in 1914, for instance, when Margaret was running for Senate and when the Conference of Great Women was happening in Newport. They took on a series of topics and planks and had women speakers who were already serving in, health departments nationally, serving in juvenile reform systems nationally, and taking on issues like, safe milk and clean drinking water and child labor laws and things like that, that were considered those women's issues, when in fact, yes, they were sort of everyone's issues. So I think there's always this interesting sort of parallel that happens over the years where women are tackling issues, social issues and social justice and civic reform issues, that we tend to be the ones to bring that legislation forward historically, rather than, when you have men in representation. So do you think then having more women in those roles helps advance those issues?
Well, I think so, because they reflect 50% of the population. And when it comes to voting, nationally and in the state, women vote like 52%. They represent 52% of the vote. When the Colorado campaign to adopt the women's suffrage amendment in 1893 ran, the slogan was, "The women can't do any worse than the men, so let them vote." So there you go.
Yeah.
And I think I have not seen a lot of that. What do I want to call it? Castigation of, well, the women can't do it anymore. Not at the legislature. They've proved their mettle. They've proved their worth. I think we've also seen that, as we all know, not all men agree with each other and not all women agree with each other. It's not a unilateral thinking. So I think that's healthy. I really do.
No. I do too. When Mrs. Brown was running for US Senate in 1914, no woman had achieved that office yet in the United States. So when she was running, it was a huge deal. It made headlines all across the country. And many of the sort of strengths that were promoted about her in the newspapers were that she was a mother and that she, had raised, multiple children, not just her own 2 children, but 3 nieces and other family members. And that, she was also a suffragist, and that she bent to the oars on the Titanic. So, and one of the slogans that she had in her campaign was that this wasn't going to be pink tea policies, no pink tea politics. This was going to be a man's fights, stump speaking, spread eagle and all. Mrs. Brown, I'm sure you can remember that quote better than me, but that she had to prop herself up or make herself appear more masculine and have masculine traits in order to be competitive in the political arena. And do you think, Jerry, that that's something that still sort of exists today when we sort of look at female candidates, how we talk about them, how we critique their work and their body of, legislation they're bringing to the table?
There's probably a bit of that happens. I mean, it's just sort of the nature of the being. But people are quick to recognize that and quick to change that as well. I've lost my train of thought here, but disagreements amongst, and I'm just going to refer to legislatures and to people as opposed to men or women, because I really think that everybody needs to work together and to accomplish the kinds of things that need to be addressed. But it's just such a healthy thing to have a healthy disagreement, a healthy discussion, and try to find that common middle and move forward from there.
Do you think that that's the strength of the League of Women Voters, that bipartisanship, that sort of, we're taking the party, politics out of the equation and talking about the issues, the social issues themselves that need to be addressed?
Oh, I think that's, yes, that's core to the League. The nonpartisan basis of the organization is it's an issue-based organization. And our most recent effort was to work on redistricting. And that was on the ballot in 2018. And to change the commissions for the congressional delegation, as well as redraw the districts for the legislative groups at the Capitol. We worked in coalition with, I have no idea how many groups at the moment, but at least 10 or 12. And everybody got to have their input, and discussions took place for well over a year before it ever got to the ballot. So, when you can reach that common consensus, I think that's a plus.
And as Mrs. Brown said once, and you can step in, Mrs. Brown, if I'm saying it wrong, that you'll stand for the human side in every equation. That really, again, it's not about sort of, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or what your sort of political stance is. It's what's the human side to the story and what's the human issue that has to be addressed. Mrs. Brown, did you have something to add?
Well, sitting here listening to this, I feel like I'm in the future, because when I think about my life at the time and the snapshot of my life of what things did and did not exist, it sounds to me the issues are the same, and they're the same from the standpoint of the acceptance of a woman's role in the world. And that's unfortunate that politics have to play into that, because as Andrea had indicated, my quote about it's the human issue, it's really the human issue that both men and women have to come up to the table to talk about. And if that doesn't exist today, I'm perhaps glad that I was living the time frame that I was living in, because things do not seem to me yes, we've made progress. We've made tremendous progress with the vote. But if I'm understanding that there's still not a representation in the Senate of a woman from Colorado, that really concerns me. That very, very much concerns me. Now, it's great to hear that there's a lot of women in the legislative side within the state itself. That's great to hear because that's progress. But I really do believe that starting now and going forward, we're still working on all the issues, and all the issues that I believe that were ignited back in the early 1900s, and they're still in flame in trying to be resolved. I'm not going to say I'm disappointed to see where we're at, but I believe we really are wasting a lot of time. And I think there should be some answers that surface up or bubble up to the top to how we can move it around and change.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. And I think you hit on something with representation, and not only representation of women in the legislature, but people of color, people of different orientations, and how do we make sure that the breadth of our societies are represented at the local, state, and federal level. And I think that's something that the centennial of the 19th Amendment at least allowed us the opportunity to really examine, in detail, was looking at the suffrage movement itself and who it represented and who it excluded. There were factions within the national suffrage movements themselves that split over the issue of race, especially when you had it being born out of the abolitionist movements. And so we're able to talk about women like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, who were Black Americans who were very much, pivotal to the suffrage movement, who until the centennial really haven't gotten their full due in franchising, another vast percentage of the population and bringing to light all of the other issues that come along with it. Does the League of Women Voters, Jerry, have sort of a historical strategy or a current strategy to either sort of diversify membership or take on issues that are directly related to issues of racism?
Yes. We have adopted DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and included the J, the justice or JEDI, a couple of years ago, and we are working on that. So yes, the short answer is yes. I just wanted to sort of address Molly Brown's concerns about the lack of females in the top elected positions from Colorado or in Colorado. One of the things we have found is that women, when it comes to campaigning, are uncomfortable asking for money, and it takes money to run a campaign. And that's one of the things that training of candidates has to address. So that's been a stumbling block for the higher offices.
I had no trouble asking for money whatsoever for anything.
Excellent.
There's actually a great organization nationally that sprung up that specifically their mission is to help women learn how to ask for money to fundraise for their campaigns, how to speak, for themselves and for their campaign, and speak on their platform and their issues. And they're called Dare to Run. So I think there's finally starting to be organizations like the League of Women Voters, Dare to Run, that are really working on how do we get women in politics? How do we make this happen? And I think when we look at women like Stacey Abrams and what she was able to accomplish in Georgia, and the groups that she started to get women in politics, to get people of color represented in politics, and how pivotal she's been, I think we're seeing sort of hopefully Mrs. Brown, a new dawn for women in representation in politics. That certainly, I think the last 2 election cycles have really brought out. Have you noticed anything through the last 2 election cycles, Jerry, that sort of shifted how the League of Women Voters has had to sort of approach things?
I haven't noticed anything that's concrete, but what we've done is move into the technology area to reach the voters. And for instance, we have a national voters guide. It's called vote411.org. And it's a complete voters guide. It tells you how to register to vote. It gives you the rules for your state, and it's a national website. So it's true for every state. It gives the candidates profiles side by side, so that if you and I were running on for, I don't know, mayor or governor, we'll choose governor. And if you and I were running for governor, we usually put out 3 very generic questions, like what are your goals or should you be elected? What is your background? What qualifies you for the office? And then we try to pick an issue that is broad enough that all voters may have some concerns about. So it's the technology that we've moved toward. We've noticed a huge interest, and you probably are aware of the largest number of voters that participated in the last election last fall. Between 2016 and 2018, they were both just huge elections, huge turnouts. So pleased with that. And we'll try to keep it going up.
Yeah. You mentioned early on that Colorado has one of the best voting processes, sort of open, transparent, and easy. And I know we have Jenna Griswold as Secretary of State right now. How do you think her being a woman plays into that at all, if it does at all, when she's doing her job? And how does Colorado serve once again as a great example for access to the ballot?
You know, one of the things that I've noticed that in the Secretary of State's office, not only under Jenna Griswold, but under her predecessor, Wayne Williams, is the high importance they've given to security, online security. Now, when we all vote by mail, that's not attached to the internet, nor is the tabulation attached to the internet. However, what is attached to the internet is the database of registered voters.
Mhm.
And if somebody wants to fiddle around with that, a hacker can get to that way. That's a problem, because it compromises the individual's right to vote, and that is not good. Both secretaries of state have brought in high-level database security people, and they have received national recognition for that. So I think the security surrounding all the electronic information that we have is just a high priority. So I have to point to that right off the bat.
Jerry, what are sort of your hopes for the next election cycle?
Oh, and it's more peaceful and quiet. My hopes are that more people, or the number of voters who turned out, continue to turn out, and that we can increase that. I think one of the other things we have going for us is that we allow 16-year-olds to register to vote when they get their driver's license. It's an opt-out rather than an opt-in situation. So it's an automatic voter registration. 16-year-olds can register to vote with the understanding that they cannot vote until they're 18. So that is one positive feature. And if you looked at the statistics of the November election of 2020, the turnout between the 18 and 35-year-olds almost doubled over what they're. That's exciting. That's really exciting because once you start voting, why you sort of laid a track record here and you're more likely to continue to vote. So I'm hopeful in that respect. Hopeful that one day we'll have a female governor and a female US senator. So,
And a female Denver mayor, the other office that hasn't happened yet.
well, I live out in Centennial and we've had 2 women mayors. So,
Well, there we go. Centennial's one up on Denver.
and we have had the couple of Black minority council members, and they still have. In fact, we've always had a Black minority council member. So pleased to have that. In fact, right now on the city council, it's a 9-member council and there's only 3 men, and I almost feel sorry for them. But so, you know, things keep moving along. It starts at the bottom and trickles up to the top. It'll happen.
Well, I'm with you in some of those hopes. I hope that at the Molly Brown House Museum, we're able to continue to use her story to, inspire people to also, be politically active, to be, involved in civics. And I think civic education is so important. And again, we can use Mrs. Brown's story to help educate people on what it means to be a voter, what is reaching out to the legal women voters, what does it mean to register as a voter, so that we continue to have high participation among women, people of color, to really make sure that the diversity of our state and our country is represented at the legislature, and so that we can address issues that affect everyone, not just women. So those are some of my hopes. Poor Mrs. Brown, she had 3 nieces that she had tagging along with her in Newport in 1914. And most of them didn't see what the fuss was about, why women would need the right to vote. So here's this strong, Margaret Brown running for US Senate and championing for women to get the right to vote. And her nieces just didn't see what the fuss was about. So I'm with you, Jerry, and I hope we can continue to encourage first-time voting and make sure that we get all of those great voters registered and stay registered to vote. So thank you, Mrs. Brown, for sharing your story with us and your opinion and how we're able to use your story as a jumping off point. I don't know if we want to open up for questions at this point, Miss Celeste.
Oh, so I have a few questions in the chat that I've been putting in as they've been coming in. Let's see. One, I think Jerry, you answered it. Just let me know if you think, and other guys might have some ideas about this. When do you think the disagreement became unhealthy? And what do you think someone on a panel like this in 30 years might say about our current times and the disagreements? And they use another word, I'll just say nastiness that's happening in politics.
I think when we can't respect each other's opinions and agree to disagree, that's when it gets to be unhealthy.
Yeah, and I think this level of sort of partisanship that's happening is not new in our country's history. And I think there are lots of examples to look back, especially when you look at New Deal era politics and Roosevelt, and sort of the flip-flop that sort of happened between the Republican and Democrat Party, when the Republicans used to be the party of the people. That was the party of abolitionists. That was the party that most, African Americans, were members of. It was the party of Lincoln. So when you look at the history of the parties, you can look at a shift that happened about mid-century and sort of how, different viewpoints have become entrenched. So I think, yeah, if we can help use whatever, we have, whether it's Mrs. Brown's story or the great work that League does to help, educate voters and people on just our own history and how we can sort of take that partisanship out of the equation would be helpful.
That's important, really important. Okay, I have several questions. Another one is, regarding barriers, I noticed there was a notice that you mentioned women tend to find it difficult to ask for money, but there are solutions such as organizations that support and help them. The question is, are there any other barriers that have been carried on from the past that are still present today? And if there are, what are some possible solutions to those?
I think for my end, it's just role models. When you have, amazing women like Kamala now as our first, vice president, when you have women like Stacey Abrams, who essentially stood up to the system in Georgia. And when you have, we had Lieutenant Governor Donna Lynn, we have, Diana DeGette representing us here in Colorado. When you have these amazing women as role models, you show that we can be on that stage, just as Margaret Brown was on that stage in many different facets in her life. Like, we can be on that stage, we can be effective, and we can create legislation that benefits everyone. And I think that is the key, just continuing to get women in, when they're in office, they're role models. So I think when we have those women to look up to and model after, we can do it.
I would agree. That's an excellent point.
So the question came in after that. What about people who don't think that those are particularly good role models? Is there a way to negate that as well? I think the question that's coming in is, so are all the women that you mentioned happen to be very liberal, very Democrat women? And what about the women or others who see them? It goes back to that idea that you were talking about before, those are women's issues. So what about people who would look at them and say, well, they're just hysterical, crazy women? Is there a way to negate that as well?
I think at this point, certainly all spectrum of women are represented in the legislature, whether it's or in some fashion in politics. You can look at, the rise of Republican women in office in the last decade is tremendous, and they're certainly taking on issues that are not the liberal issues. So I think there are also role models within the Republican Party to look at. There are role models within the Independent and the Green. There, each party has had its strong candidates it's put up. So I think if the issues are what, turns you away from a specific candidate, I think you can find role models for other issues, whether they're a representative or not.
I'm going to add to that. I don't disagree with it. In fact, I totally agree with it. I think I'm going to go back to the participation of the average citizen in their political party or in the political structure. And when a certain segment remains silent, the power is handed to a group that you may not appreciate. And I think that's another factor. So I think people have to step up to the plate and participate in both parties.
And I think, just a basic understanding, I think it's percolated up in the education world and in the history world, how much our civics education has sort of failed us in the last couple decades, and how we have, a whole voting base of people that don't know how our voting system works, how our representation in government works. What are the, they are just, we don't know that anymore. So I think it also needs to come all the way back to civics education in the classroom, so we even understand how our own democracy works.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and that, go ahead. Are you going to go ahead, Jerry?
Oh, I just said I totally agree.
Well, and that leads to another question that's being asked. You said the first part of it was, they asked the question, what was the organization? You said Dare to Run. And then the question was, is Dare to Run bipartisan? And then there was a follow-up to that about the League of Women Voters. And the question is, what about social issues? Do you try?
Bipartisan. Here we go.
As far as I know, they are like the League of Women Voters. They're not concerned with what party you want to run, what your politics are. They're just there to support you as a woman who wants to run for office. And how do you empower yourself? How do you fundraise? How do you talk about your issues? But you can check out their website, and I follow them on social media, and they're always promoting women in politics. Women are running in office, and lots of great, especially now when we can do things virtually so much more, having, you know, lots of opportunities to connect with them and connect with people on how to train to run for office.
Cool. All right. Well, do you guys have, we're getting close to, well, actually, we're past the end. Do any of you guys have a final say? Is there anything you want to make sure that you get into the ears of those who will be listening?
Other than for me, looking it through the eyes of Margaret Brown, I think she would be very impressed. I mentioned that earlier, the progress that has been made. But I also think she'd be very supportive of what Andrea has spoken about and the women that are starting to be more engaged at the higher level. When I say higher level, you mentioned some of the liberal women like Stacey Abrams, that, and some other people. I think she would have been right in there with them. I think she would have been sitting right next to him, elbow to elbow, trying to make a difference. But the last thing that I would say that was touched on is the respect for each other is, excuse me, is the most important thing. Respect for people's opinions and respect for their differences. I'm not hearing we have a lot of that today, but I'm so glad to hear that women are fighting and, excuse me, pardon me, and continue to fight. And that's all basically, I don't know if Andrea wants to throw anything out that she thinks Margaret would think. What little I know, Andrea knows a tremendous amount about her, but the years that I've been interpreting her, I learned more and more and more and more about her and how she easily would have fit in today.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown, and thank you, Janet, for taking on the larger than life persona of Mrs. Brown for us this evening. It's no small task to wear those big hats.
No, and looking forward to removing this hat soon.
And for us at the Molly Brown House Museum, we always take it back to how do we know what we know? What are the primary sources? We research and we look for facts to help inform our interpretation and decisions. And we think history is so important to look at and study and analyze so that we can then make more informed decisions today, so that we can then pull those threads forward. We can look at Mrs. Brown's biography and use that as an opportunity to look at women like Ida B. Wells and look at Carrie Chapman Catt and look at Alice Paul and the amazing work they did to help enfranchise half the population 100 years ago and help, eventually start the League of Women Voters and, create this legacy that we're still, running through today and, trying to, get women more active in politics and take on those human issues that Mrs. Brown wanted to tackle as well.
Thank you. Jerry, you have anything final? We really appreciate your part in the conversation.
It's been great to be a part of this discussion. I have to credit the League of Women Voters with my civic education and the fact that I've been able to, because of my participation and my work with the League, I've been able to get to know my elected officials, whether it's at the local level or the state level, and it's something I really value. So I appreciate that, and all of the great work at the Molly Brown House is doing and all of the work that we're all doing. So all the best to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much, ladies. And thanks to everybody. I'm going to sign off now and we'll see you next month. All right, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wait a minute. Hang on.
Mhm.